Welcome to the debate. Today, we are digging into the material coming out of the United Nations ESCK, Asia Pacific Regional Commemoration of International Women's Day 2026.
Yeah, and for those who might not live and breathe UN acronyms, ESCK is the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. The theme for this particular gathering was rights, justice, action for all women and girls. And it had this really sharp focus on one specific area, namely how we actually ensure and strengthen access to justice across the region.
Exactly. It brought together state ambassadors, civil society leaders, and youth delegates to, examine the profound inequities that are still persisting. But as we reviewed the proceedings, a really fundamental disagreement emerged about how we actually solve this. It's basically a classic question of causation and strategy.
It really is. The central intellectual question here is, in the pursuit of true gender equity, what has to be the primary catalyst for change? Like, are we looking at the implementation of robust, binding legal and structural frameworks from the top down? Or do we have to fundamentally prioritize the transformation of sociocultural norms? Everyday community mindsets from the ground up.
Right. And when I look at this material, I can't get past the structures. I'll be arguing that formal, structural, and legal reforms, specifically binding regulations, the explicit repeal of discriminatory laws, and strict institutional mandates, these are the essential, non-negotiable foundation for achieving justice. Because without the hard architecture of the law, equity is it's a theoretical luxury.
I come at it from a different way. I'll be arguing that sociocultural transformation simply has to lead. You can draft the most meticulous legal frameworks in the world, but as the evidence in our source material demonstrates, those laws are ultimately toothless when they're deployed within deeply prejudiced societies. Shifting everyday community mindsets, changing institutional cultures, and actively engaging male allies, that is where the real power lies.
Let's start with the basic mechanics of state power then. Rights and justice require tangible, enforceable mechanisms. During the ESCCAP commemoration, UN Women Regional Director Christine Arab articulated this perfectly. She reminded the Assembly that women's rights are absolutely non-negotiable.
And nobody is arguing that rights should be negotiated away.
Right, but her point is that they cannot be left to the goodwill of a given community or the gradual, eventual evolution of cultural sentiment. They have to be grounded in international law and reflected in national commitments that governments are strictly held to.
But look at where that top-down approach has gotten us, honestly.
Well, let's look at the numbers. When you look at the upcoming Beijing Plus 30 review, which is essentially our global report card on gender equality over the last 3 decades, the reality is stark. Globally, women still only possess 64% of the legal rights of men.
Which is an unacceptable statistic, absolutely.
It is. No country has achieved full legal equality. Over half of the countries in the world lack consent-based legal definitions of rape. 44% do not mandate equal remuneration for work of equal value, and 3/4 allow child marriage in some form. You cannot simply educate or culturally shift your way out of a system where the law itself explicitly permits your subjugation.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Structural changes, while they look great on a UN report, are entirely hollow without foundational cultural buy-in. To borrow a concept highlighted by the youth ambassador shadowing Ambassador Angela McDonald at the event, norms precede laws.
But laws shape norms over time?
They do, yeah, but laws don't exist in a vacuum. They are written, interpreted, and enforced by human beings who are products of their sociocultural environments. Ambassador McDonald correctly pointed out that how societies, families, and schools treat people, regardless of their gender, dictates the actual reality of equality on the ground.
So you're saying a law mandating equal pay is useless?
I'm saying you can mandate equal pay or outlaw child marriage, but if the societal norm dictates that women are inherently of lesser value, those laws will be ignored. They'll be circumvented, or they will be so weakly enforced that they might as well not exist.
I don't think we can dismiss the procedural power of the state quite that easily. The preparatory meetings for the 70th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, what they call CSEW 70, laid out clear structural imperatives. They aren't just talking about writing a law and walking away. They're talking about eliminating discriminatory laws and establishing highly formalized referral pathways between police, courts, and social services.
But what happens when the survivor actually enters that pathway? We heard this explicitly from ESCAP Executive Secretary Armida Salcia Alishabana. She noted that laws alone are wholly insufficient if victim-blaming, gender bias, and discriminatory attitudes persist within those very institutions.
Which is exactly why the institutions themselves need strict operational mandates.
But mandates don't change how a community looks at a survivor. She pointed out a devastating truth. In many contexts, survivors fear the social stigma of reporting a crime more than they fear the violence itself. A robust legal referral pathway is completely useless to a woman who is too terrified of community ostracization to ever step foot inside a police station.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it underestimates the power of the law to force behavioral compliance, even when cultural attitudes lag behind. Let's move this to a modern, rapidly evolving battleground that was discussed at length in the material: digital spaces and platform accountability.
Right. Technology-facilitated gender-based violence.
Exactly. We heard from Ms. Debbie, the Deputy Commissioner for Safety and former Online Safety Commissioner of Fiji. She detailed the explosion of things like image-based abuse, non-consensual sharing of intimate images, and sextortion.
It's a massive crisis. No question about it.
And for years, the approach to this was essentially sociocultural. We relied on the goodwill of tech companies, their voluntary community standards, and user education. We tried to, change the culture of the internet. And Ms. Debbie unequivocally stated that this voluntary cooperation has completely failed.
Failed in what sense, though?
In the sense that it results in slow responses, opaque decision-making, and environments where anonymity shields perpetrators. So what did Fiji do? They implemented the Online Safety Act of 2018. They provided a hard, civil regulatory pathway. And Ms. Debbie's primary recommendation for the next 5 years is the establishment of binding regional regulatory frameworks.
Meaning forcing the platforms to comply legally.
Yes. Forcing rapid removal obligations and clear legal recognition of digital abuse. We've learned we cannot culturally convince an algorithm to have a moral compass. You cannot educate a multinational tech conglomerate into protecting women when their business model relies on engagement. You must legally compel them to do so across borders.
I hear that, but if you look closely at her complete argument, even Ms. Debbie concludes that regulatory frameworks have severe limitations.
Especially concerning cross-border jurisdiction.
Which is exactly why she is calling for regional frameworks.
But think about the logistics of that. A perpetrator is in one country, the victim is in another, and the platform is headquartered somewhere else entirely. The law physically cannot move fast enough to contain an intimate image that is shared globally in seconds.
But a legal mandate forces the platform to have mechanisms in place to pull it down instantly. It's still a game of whack-a-mole. You are treating victims as complainants in a procedural pipeline after the damage is already done. That is precisely why Ms. Debbie concluded her remarks by stating that safer digital environments are ultimately created by societies that refuse to tolerate abuse.
But society tolerates a lot of things until the law says they can't.
The sociocultural approach emphasizes digital literacy, community awareness, and culturally grounded prevention. It builds actual resilience. It stops the behavior before the image is ever uploaded. If the culture shifts to one where possessing or distributing non-consensual images carries profound social disgust, the supply and demand for that abuse plummets. Laws can only punish the harm after the trauma has been inflicted. Norms prevent the trauma from occurring in the first place.
Okay, but let's look at who actually gets left behind when we rely on cultural disgust to protect people. That brings us to a really critical juncture in the proceedings regarding intersecting identities and marginalized groups, specifically the structural denial of justice for women with disabilities.
Yeah, this was a heavily impactful part of the gathering.
Nidhi Goyal, the founder of Rising Flame, presented a chilling statistical reality. 1 in 5 women globally lives with a disability. In the Asia-Pacific region alone, that is approximately 350 million women and girls.
And their risk of facing violence is 2 to 3 times higher than non-disabled women.
Exactly.
But the core of Boyle's argument wasn't just about social stigma or community attitudes. It was about the explicit, formalized legal structures that strip these women of their humanity. She highlighted guardianship regimes that exist right now in national legal systems.
Meaning the state legally hands over their decision-making power to someone else.
Yes, these are laws that legally restrict the capacity of persons with disabilities to make decisions about their own lives. We are talking about the state legally sanctioning forced institutionalization, forced medication, and horrifyingly, forced abortions and sterilizations.
It's state-sanctioned abuse.
And when a woman is not regarded as a legal citizen with agency over her own bodily autonomy, seeking justice isn't just difficult, it is structurally impossible. Repealing these discriminatory laws is the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite. You cannot begin to talk about cultural empowerment for a woman when the state has legally decreed she is not the owner of her own body.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered what actually drives the creation, maintenance, and enforcement of those guardianship laws in the first place?
It's a structural mechanism of control.
But fueled by what? It is fueled by underlying socio-cultural stigma. The laws do not exist in a vacuum. They are the codified manifestation of a society that perceives women with disabilities, especially psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, as infantilized and incapable of decision-making. Guile herself pointed out that they are routinely viewed as unreliable and discredited witnesses.
But if you repeal the law, they have legal standing.
You can repeal the formal guardianship clause tomorrow, but if the judge, the police officer, and the family members still possess the cultural mindset that the disabled woman is incompetent, they will find other ways to restrict her autonomy. They will deny her justice informally. The cultural rot is the source. The law is merely a symptom of that rot.
I can see that the stigma is profound and that it complicates enforcement. But without repealing that law, she has zero recourse. The state is actively working against her.
But systemic vulnerability takes many forms, and the limits of a top-down legal approach become really obvious when we look at layered marginalization. Think about the context of climate justice, which was raised by the youth ambassador Nyasma from Patani.
Right, she spoke about the unpredictable flooding in southern Thailand.
Exactly. Now, how does a national law on gender equity or climate resilience help a single mother in Patani whose main source of income is rubber tapping? When the floods come, her work stops instantly, but her household burdens multiply.
Well, the state should have structural safety nets.
But a top-down legal decree written in a capital city doesn't fix this highly localized, layered vulnerability. Understanding those lived experiences and fundamentally shifting community support systems is what keeps those women afloat. It's an issue of fairness and equity recognized at the community level. If her community doesn't value her economic contribution or support her during a flood, a national law isn't going to put food on her table.
And that's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently.
How so?
While localized support is obviously vital, relying on community empathy to solve systemic economic and environmental crises is incredibly precarious. Vulnerability is indeed layered, which is exactly why the systemic response must be structural. If her community happens to be prejudiced, she is left with nothing.
But if the institutions are prejudiced, she is also left with nothing.
Which requires us to look at reforming the justice system itself. If the culture of the police and the judiciary is flawed, as you suggest, we cannot simply wait decades for a generational mindset shift. We have to force the change structurally.
How do you force a judge to be unbiased?
By building a system where a survivor doesn't have to rely on the subjective bias of a judge, the CSW70 preparatory meeting summarized by EastCap's Chai Chai provided concrete mechanisms for this. They didn't just call for better attitudes. They demanded the adoption of temporary special measures to aggressively accelerate gender parity in senior judicial and law enforcement roles.
Quotas, essentially.
Yes. Furthermore, they demanded significantly increased public and private financing for access to justice and the strict collection of gender disaggregated data to drive evidence-based policy. When you mandate diversity quotas, when you legally force police, courts, and hospitals to share a referral pathway so victims aren't re-traumatized by telling their story 5 times, you override the biased cultural norms. You force a historically biased system to act equitably through procedural compliance and budgetary allocation.
I see the appeal of that structural force. It sounds clean.
But Dr. Fissett from the Thailand Institute of Justice provided a profound counter-argument to that exact strategy.
He was warning about the limits of quotas, right?
Exactly. He warned that simply elevating women into high-ranking judicial or law enforcement roles through temporary special measures is insufficient, and it can actually be counterproductive if the institutional culture remains static.
How is putting women in power counterproductive?
Because if you parachute women into a deeply patriarchal system, you run the massive risk of forcing those prominent female personnel to conform to established male standards just to survive and advance in their careers. They become integrated into the very norm we are trying to dismantle.
So what is the alternative to forcing diversity?
Transforming the culture of the institution itself. Dr. Fissett advocated for tools like design thinking to map the actual journeys of survivors through the system. This isn't a procedural mandate. It's an exercise in fostering deep institutional empathy.
Empathy in a bureaucracy?
Yes, it shifts the mindset of justice personnel from being purely focused on the bureaucracy to genuinely understanding the trauma of the person standing in front of them. Furthermore, transforming this culture requires bringing everyone into the conversation, a point powerfully made by Youth Ambassador Giro Fontan.
Engaging men and boys.
Precisely. He spoke to the absolute necessity of male allies. By creating inclusive spaces where men and boys are actively engaged, gender equity transitions from being perceived as just a women's issue to a shared societal responsibility. You cannot mandate that kind of inclusive empathy through a temporary special measure. It must be culturally cultivated.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on empathy. Empathy without enforcement is just sympathy, and sympathy does not yield justice.
But a system without empathy re-traumatizes the survivor.
I'm not saying this system shouldn't be empathetic, but what we heard throughout the East Cap Regional Commemoration is that justice cannot merely exist in doctrine, nor can it rely on the personal courage of individuals or the progressive goodwill of a localized community.
Dr. Fissett actually noted that himself. We need institutions where fairness doesn't depend on personal courage.
Exactly. Which brings me to the summary of my position in light of our discussion today. While mindsets and sociocultural norms undeniably matter, treating them as the primary vehicle for change is a dangerous gamble.
Even when the laws are failing?
The laws fail when they aren't robust enough, without a firm, unforgiving legal bedrock. Whether that means enforcing cross-border platform accountability to combat digital abuse in Fiji, or abolishing archaic guardianship laws that strip disabled women of their basic humanity across the region, vulnerable groups remain entirely unprotected by the state. The structural framework is the only mechanism that guarantees rights as universal and non-negotiable, rather than treating them as cultural preferences.
And to summarize my stance, a legal framework, no matter how impeccably designed to be universal and non-negotiable, is ultimately written, administered, and enforced by a society.
But it sets the standard.
It sets a standard on paper, but if that society is deeply infected with discriminatory norms, the laws will consistently fail the marginalized. The empirical evidence shows us that survivors fear the social stigma of their communities more than they fear the lack of a legal statute.
So we just wait for society to change its mind?
We actively change it. Whether we are talking about the deeply entrenched biases that lead to the silencing of disabled women, the communal apathy toward online harassment, or the established male standards within the judiciary itself, the root cause is always cultural. By changing the underlying sociocultural environment through empathetic design thinking in our courts, comprehensive community education, and the active engagement of male allies, we ensure that our justice systems are actually accessible, utilized, and trusted by the survivors they are meant to serve.
It is very clear that while we diverge on the primary catalyst for change, there are distinct areas of convergence in our analysis. The proceedings from the UN ESCAP commemoration beautifully illustrate that this is not an entirely binary choice in practice.
Exactly. We see that laws and norms are locked in this perpetual feedback loop. A structural mandate can occasionally force a cultural shift, just as a cultural awakening can demand the drafting of new structural protections.
They push and pull against each other.
They do. They must eventually evolve together to create a society that is both legally sound and culturally equitable.
And looking at access to justice through both a rigid structural lens and a nuanced sociocultural lens is vital to fully appreciating the sheer complexity of gender equality today. From the climate-impacted rubber tappers in Patani to the digital citizens navigating online abuse across the Pacific, to the disabled women fighting for basic bodily autonomy, there's so much more to explore in the lived experiences of women navigating these systems.
Indeed. The path forward requires constant scrutiny of both the laws we write and the norms we live by. We will leave it to our listeners to weigh these arguments and consider which forces ultimately drive the most meaningful change in their own communities.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.